Thank you, everybody, for coming to today's lecture. And thank you to our online viewers for this book reading with Dr. Nadia Haj, who will present her recently published book, Protection Amid Chaos, The Creation of Property Rights in Palestinian Refugee Camps. My name is Samira Al-Qasim. I'm the program manager here at the Jerusalem Fund. In her book, Dr. Haj discusses the property rights of Palestinians living in the refugee camps, specifically Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria, where in some cases they've lived for generations. For this book, she interviewed 200 refugees and consulted memoirs, legal documents, and findings in the United Nations Relief Works Agency archives. Her examination begins in the early days of the Nakba, looking at how the first to arrive in the camps developed simultaneously flexible and legitimate property rights claims based on legal knowledge they brought from their homeland that was then adopted to the context of refugee life. Dr. Haj then traces how, as the camps became more complex over time, refugees merged their informal institutions with the formal rules of political outsiders, devising a larger and more robust system for protecting their assets and culture from state incorporation and predators. She will explain more about all of this. This is just my paraphrasing her synopsis of this fascinating book, which is a groundbreaking study on the subject, and which you can buy afterwards in the boardroom, and which you will sign. So about our speaker, Dr. Nadia Haj is an assistant professor of political science and Middle East studies at Wellesley College. She completed her undergraduate studies at the University of Virginia and attained her MA and PhD from Emory University. At Wellesley, she teaches comparative politics, political economy, and Middle East politics. Her research examines how refugee communities, and in particular Palestinian refugees, created order in the midst of chaotic political economic landscapes. And she spent more than 10 years conducting interviews in refugee camps across Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria, which has fed into this book. Her research has been published in the Journal of Policy Studies and Comparative Politics, and she's working, I think, her next project she'll tell you more about, but it also is very fascinating, and it connects to this book that she's going to talk about today. So thank you. Can we give her a warm welcome?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Nadia Haj. I'm an assistant professor at Wellesley College, and I'm very honored to be invited to speak to you here today, so thank you. The title of my talk today is Protection Amid Chaos, the Creation of Property Rights Among Palestinian Refugees in Palestinian Refugee Camps. So I wanted to start this presentation off by kind of motivating the puzzle behind the book. Why am I writing this, and why should it matter to you? This is the common image or the common portrait of Palestinian refugee camps that many are presented with. In describing them in usually popular media or newspapers, they're described as tented fields, filled with pitiful, kind of helpless people, relying on handouts. And while, yes, indeed, the early years in the camps were quite difficult, I think it's only presenting a partial portrait of life there. And before I get to the other side of what I think is going on in the camps, I want to describe what's happening in this picture to you. I mean, visually, you can see this was taken in 1953. There's no electrical wires. There's no plumbing. This is a place where it was a hard place to live. What you don't know about this photo is that it's a really important one to me personally. I saw it. And I think about it often because I know that my father was living in one of these tents when this photo was taken. And as a child, it captured my imagination. My father lived in a tent. As a child living in a modern building in Kuwait, I thought, this is odd. What is going on here? What was it like? So much of my childhood was filled with stories of how challenging it was, how it felt to be hungry and literally starving and just struggling to survive. And so it was a very difficult place to live, and we should never forget that. But this is a photo I took of the camp in 2005, and I think we should admire this transformation, right? From tented fields, now you're moving to buildings that are much more solid in structure. It's not going to win any architectural awards, but certainly it's a much more secure foundation to be living in than in a tent. You'll see electrical wires, you'll see plumbing, you see also shop awnings, that's a sign of industry happening, cars, like a bustling market, people out shopping. You know, what's also fascinating about this is that I spent many years in graduate school reading about how hard it is to develop any economy. And especially if a state's not involved, one would predict that it wouldn't happen at all. But here you're seeing an image of a camp that visually you can see has changed. Development has occurred. How did this occur? Especially when we know what the Palestinian situation is. That in Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria, there's no host state involvement in the development of the community. And aside from the United Nations Relief Works Agency providing basic welfare and social services, anything you're seeing here is the result of the effort of Palestinians themselves. This is something that was not described at all in any text I had encountered. And so it's what motivated my central research question. The question, how do communities find protection amid chaos? What do they do to go from tented field to an amazing, bustling city that is captured in this refugee camp? So to answer this question, it would be so nice, right, if the answer had just been online and one click away through Google. But no, I had to do about 10 years of field research to get at this. And one of the important things about this is that I searched for the answer by talking to everyday Palestinian refugees. This is actually my cousin Jihan, who lives in one of the camps. I talk to people other than my family, but these are people that approved their photos to be shown. So I spoke to everyday rank and file Palestinians. These are not elites. They're not wealthy. They're not special in any way. They're probably like you and me, hardworking people. This is another image. That's my dad and my aunt, God rest her soul. But these are the types of people that I was speaking to. And as Samira said, I spoke to over 200 Palestinian refugees in trying to get an answer, asking them in as many different ways as I could, how did you do this and what did you do? The central narrative that I heard was one of functioning in disaster. And in particular, from one interview you can read, one man said, the hard conditions challenged us every day. We were forced to be creative and create a system of order that worked for us. So what was this system of order that Palestinians crafted that helped them navigate the chaos of living in a camp where no host state was telling you what to do, where you arrive with no water, no electricity, and you have to build yourself up? Well, I'm going to talk about something that you might think is kind of boring, property rights. But I actually think they're much more exciting than you may have heard about in an econ class, you know, your first year in college. Property rights, to me, are pretty fantastic. And Palestinians actually pointed to them as one key set of institutions that helped the community create order amidst chaos. So property rights are a bundle of entitlements defining ownership of an asset. Okay, that's a kind of abstract, really jargony definition. But you in this audience or listening online probably own something. And how do you know you own it? If you look in your car glove box, you probably have a title. Or if you look at your home, you probably have a title establishing ownership of your home. It specifies the location or dimensions of that home. It also entails, through that ownership, that you have the ability to protect that asset, and that in conjunction with it, there's probably a judicial system or a security force of some kind that will uphold your title and your claim to that title. Okay, so there's formal ones, and that's usually what a title is, but there's also informal types of property rights. And informal ones are where maybe it's not so common among Americans as we might think about it. Informal property rights usually rely on a handshake. Right? You agree to something, changing ownerships. I'm going to shake hands with you on that. Classically in economics literature, when you talk about an informal property right, the example that's often given is when you're driving and you encounter a one-lane little tiny bridge, and you see two cars coming to it at the same moment in time. Who owns that bridge first? Well, we don't have a formal system usually. We don't, pull over to the side of the road, have a conference, sign a paper, and it agrees one car goes before the other. No, it's usually an informal temporary claim on that who owns that bridge and can safely passage across it. That's an informal type of property right. In the context of Palestinian refugee camps, we're going to discover as I go forward in this talk that there were both informal property rights for a period of time that later transformed into more formal titles. And I'll talk about those in a moment. But I also want to draw something of a distinction from previous scholars. Property rights are often talked about as important because there's some economic value to it. If people feel secure in their ownership of an asset, oh, they're going to be willing to invest in it and develop it more. And why would a state be so happy about that? Taxes, right? Okay, so there's an economic reasons for property rights to exist. But I'm going to make the case, and this is an innovation of the text, that property rights do much more for communities living in chaos. That the way in which you define who owns what and the way in which the community protects that resource, you can do it in a particularly Palestinian way. And that by doing it in a Palestinian way, you're enshrining your community's identity, an identity that's definitely under assault. Your basic existence is being challenged. And these institutions, these property rights, not only protect assets, but protect your identity of what your community stands for and how it protects itself. And by doing it in your own way, in the Palestinian way, and we'll talk about what that looked like, you kind of protect yourself from outsiders trying to incorporate you or predate on you. And it's a way of protecting the community and enshrining your identity from potential challenges from much more powerful actors, host states that you'll encounter along the way. So let's get a little specific. Most of you are familiar with the Nakba, but that's referring to the 1948 moment when the refugee crisis emerged, the catastrophe, as Palestinians referred to it. And in 1948, when Palestinians arrived in refugee camps, I don't want to pretend that it was kumbaya and very harmonious, all right? The first moments in the camp were awful. Imagine, have some empathy. Imagine yourself in their shoes. When you arrive in a camp and you're thrown in with people from your own family and village, okay, you're okay with that. But now you're meeting people from faraway villages, and you're all being tossed into a place, and no one's telling you where to set up camp. You're going to fight over resources. You're going to get in disagreements. And that's the truth. The first early years in the camps, in refugee interviews, people said it was hard. No, we didn't always like each other. And in fact, in Nahr al-Bared, there were several battles or small conflicts that were fought on the beach. And there are stories of older women recalling holding stones in their skirts, holding them for their male family members to throw at one another. Well, you can imagine these battles were not epic. No one's writing about them really. And they also were not particularly successful in determining any winner. And Palestinians started to realize after a few years of fighting with one another in these camps that we have to figure out a way to get along. And how are we going to get along? How are we going to determine who owns what? And how are we going to respect those boundaries? And it's probably not surprising that the community looked back to what and how they had lived in Palestine and how the community had defined ownership prior to arriving in the refugee camps. And this is what I'm going to make the case that early in the camp, informal agreements started to emerge rather organically. Palestinians looked to pre-1948 norms and used the family and village unit, the Ahl and Hamullah, which is usually a more Palestinian term to call a tribe of Hamullah, but they used these units as the organizing units to determine who owned what. So it wouldn't be an individual claiming ownership. It was an entire family that claimed ownership of a particular plot of a land. And each family and village located next to each other. So what you'll often find in camps is reproduction of pre-village structures inside the camp. So all the people in Nahr al-Bared that had come from the village of Samui continued to live next to one another. Another segment of the camp was usually to another village, Sa'sa, for example, Safuri, Safa, just to name a few in Nahr al-Bared specifically. But you see the community mapping itself and organizing ownership of the plots based on the family unit. This is distinct. in the US, you don't really organize things based on the family unit. Usually it's an individual making a claim. And here it's being done in a particularly Palestinian way of family ownership and village ownership, or broader tribal claims. Well, okay, so that's how they define who owns what. But how do they determine informally how to protect that asset? Again, there's no police or security force to call up if there's a dispute. How are you going to resolve a dispute? And in this, I think if you've grown up in any Arab society, you're used to the concept of shame. And while shame has its downsides, and as a child, I think I heard ayib every other minute. I was doing something shameful. I don't know what I was doing, but it was shameful. At any moment in time, there was something ayib happening, right? And so this notion of ayib, of shame and honor, were used in a really powerful way in the camps. If you don't have a police officer, standing there scary, dissuading you from stealing or doing something to someone else's tent, why would you not just, run around and see mayhem and lots of stealing occurring at every moment? Well, in the context of the Palestinian refugee community, you saw that people use this notion of honor. If you want to honor your family name, you would not dare steal from someone else within the village. You'll start to see that in adapting the past to the present, there's often this line that I had heard in some interviews: me and my brother against our cousin, and me and my cousin against the stranger, which sounds like a slightly odd thing to say, but it defines, right, this ownership, this idea of who matters and how you should behave in relationship to them. I would not dare do anything to my brother, and I definitely would not do anything to my cousin. And ultimately, it would always be me and my cousin against the stranger. These kind of strong family ties distinguish, codes of behavior between people. And you didn't need a police force to keep people in line. These notions of what was honorable or shameful caused people to self-regulate or self-discipline themselves to not do the wrong thing in the context of the camp. I'm being a little abstract here, so let me give you some specific quotes that I heard to reaffirm what I'm saying to you. So one person said, "I rarely encountered problems like stealing and expropriation with my business in the camp because we have strong Palestinian values. It's shameful for your family if you did these things. Everyone would know your reputation was ruined if you behaved that way." Another person said, "There are strong religious and community values that are very traditional here. It makes protection an easy thing for us." I thought this one was really powerful, the final one. "If one's family name was tarnished, it influenced the ability of people to marry and conduct future business in the area. A bad event had implications for future generations of your family." If your brother was the bad one and stole, he ruined your chances to ever get married. That's a pretty powerful, norm to restrain your behavior. These informal understandings of what was appropriate or inappropriate behavior in the context of the camps were informally maintained. Again, no police force is doing this, but the community developed its own code to protect the assets, again, which has this economic benefit that we all recognize. But I hope you're also starting to see how it reaffirms what it meant to be Palestinian, even when you're living in a displaced location in the context of a camp. We could still act like Palestinians as we define it, even though we're very far away from what we feel is our true home. And I think that's, should reaffirm to you that these informal property rights definitely existed, okay? Things were going along swimmingly, well, as swimmingly as possible at a refugee camp. And then in 1969, something profound occurred, a profound political event occurred. I won't spend too much time going into Middle Eastern history here, but I'll name two key events that occurred. One is the Cairo Accords. And the Cairo Accords were signed in 1969 and allowed the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Hizb al-Tahrir al-Falastini, to assert sovereignty in the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. At that same moment in time, something was about to happen or brewing in Jordan, which was in 1969-70 Black September, which was the moment in which the PLO and many Palestinian political organizations were being kicked out of Jordan, many of them relocating to Lebanon. And so you have these two events occurring. So for the Palestinians living in the camps, what did this mean? Again, you have to imagine, and also in 1967 there was another big war that was fought. So there's this period of time in which there's a lot of chaos reoccurring, right? A lot of frightening things are happening. And it was, to many people, another type of Nakba for them. And so in the midst of this chaos, I was very surprised to learn how resilient informal property rights were and how Palestinians were able to adapt these informal claims to the new political landscape in which they were living. In particular, at that same moment in time that the Cairo Accords and Black September is happening, inside the camps you had the PLO asserting its dominance in the camps, as well as the Jordanian authorities asserting their authority in the camps as well, and saying, hey, we're the new guys in town, and you're going to do things our way. And I'm not going to make the argument that Palestinians weren't sympathetic to the PLO, but in some way, the PLO had to win favor with the people in the community. And there was a bit of resistance. Palestinians had been doing things their own way in the camps, and who are these outsiders to come in and tell me how to do it, right? At this moment in time, when a host state or an outsider is coming into the camps, there's a few potential pathways that one could choose. On the one hand, you could fight. The Palestinians could fight and say, I refuse to submit to the PLO, I refuse to submit to the Jordanian authorities. But I think Palestinians were strategic enough to realize, we're probably not going to win that battle against someone much more powerful than ourselves. Well, the other option is total submission. We give up, we're going to do it exactly as you asked us to, but if you know something about Palestinians, they aren't likely to just roll over and accept things. So what was very fascinating was that they chose this middle pathway in which they decide, I'm not going to be able to win this entirely. This new system of property rights that these outsiders are trying to kind of lay into the camps, and by the way, why would an outsider be so interested in formalizing titles? Tax money, right? And so, Palestinians recognize I'm not going to be able to do things entirely like I did prior to 1969, this 1948 way that I had talked about once they arrived. But they do see that there's a way in which they can meld their own ways of enforcement with the formal titling system that outsiders are putting into the camps. They're going to avoid total state incorporation. I'll show you this image. This is inside Lajna Sha'biya, the kind of Palestinian Popular Camp Committee. I think this one's in Bedawi, but very sophisticated filing system, right? But here's the file cabinet and the binders filled with property titles, formal documents. And if you look at my book, in the back of the book in the appendix, you can see the formal titles that establish Palestinian ownership of homes in the camps. They look a lot like titles of the ones we have of our own homes in the United States. So there's this formal document, and the stamp at the bottom is either in Jordan with kind of a Jordanian authority on it, or in the camps here, there's a PLO stamp that asserts that yes, this Palestinian owns this property. But what happens when there's enforcement issues? If you have this formal title, theoretically, if there's a problem, you should be going to Lajna Sha'biya, or you should be going to the Jordanian CSIC office, which is located in every camp, to resolve your conflict. But in interviews, and I think this is the beauty of interviews, I asked Palestinians, so if there's a problem, what do you do? Who do you go to? Don't you go to the authorities? Hell no. They don't go to the authorities. They say, no, we deal with it amongst ourselves. We have our own codes of honor and shame that we've been using since 1948, and we want to continue to deal with it within the Palestinian community in our way. And so you can see here this powerful moment in which you're seeing a melding of course, there's a formal titling system that's been imposed on them from outside or from above, but they in some ways subvert it because they maintain their own system of enforcement that runs parallel to this formal system. okay, the story could end here. And as a graduate student, I'll let you know, I published my dissertation after this moment in 2006. I was pretty much done. And then, if you know a little something about what happened in Nahr al-Bared camp, this one that I showed the image of to you at the very start, something bad happened. And of course, I have very loving parents. I happened to be in Nahr al-Bared in March of 2007 when Fatah al-Islam first arrived in the camp. And what did they do to make themselves known? They had a little bomb go off. And of course, my mom and dad are like, leave, go, go. And I'm like, no, this is very exciting. This is my research. I must be here. No, I had to leave. So little did I know that I would leave in March 2007. I thought I was going to go to Jordan, and I collected data for many months in Jordan, for another 6 months in camps. But I thought I was going to be returning right away back to Lebanon. It would not be until 2012 that I would get to return. Because what happened in 2007 is that Nahr al-Bared camp was destroyed in the crossfire, during a battle between Fatah al-Islam, a political group with murky underpinnings, which we can talk about in the Q&A if you'd like to, of who funded it. There's lots of conspiracy theorists out there. And their challenges to Lebanese army and military authority that occurred in Tripoli. And during this battle, Nahr al-Bared was completely destroyed. This was another moment, a double dispossession of Nahr al-Bared's refugees. Again, another moment of complete chaos. How would these property right institutions fare, right? All of you were probably not thinking that, but that's what I was thinking at this moment in time in 2007. What would occur? I mean, just so you see, this is, one image from the camp in 2012, okay? This is another, just an image from a wall. And so, once Nahr al-Bared was destroyed, it wasn't clear initially whether or not the camp was going to be rebuilt. But in fact, in consultation with the international aid community, the UNRWA, Palestinian officials, the camp was agreed to be rebuilt. You can probably understand why the Lebanese would not be too thrilled, right? They kind of drug their feet along and agreed, yes, we'll rebuild the camps. But the Lebanese were really upset, right, that this attack had happened in 2007. And they said Palestinians could no longer own property in the newly reconstructed camp. This was said. And of course, as I'm reading these reports, I'm like, this is the end of my whole research life that I've spent so many years. I'm so self-interested here. Of course, there's this tragedy, but what does this mean for property rights? That's it, they're done. But again, it's this moment in time where Palestinians faced several options like they had faced in 1969. Okay, on the one hand, they could have totally submitted to the Lebanese rule and said, yep, the Lebanese say it can't happen and we're going to go along with it. On the other hand, they could have tried to resist violently, but if you're a Star Trek fan and know the Borg thing, resistance is futile, it would be pretty futile for them to try and violently react against the Lebanese military. And so they again chose a very strategic middle pathway. And this is where a very fascinating thing occurred. The international community, one of the stipulations in reconstructing the camp was that the new camp must maintain the previous social fabric of the camp. So remember how earlier I mentioned to you that villages like Samui, Safuri, Sa'sa, and Safad were all, located within themselves and next to each other? That had to be maintained in the new camp. So mechanically, how would you know where to put people? I did interviews with Khatib al-Alami and other of the engineering firms that were involved in the rebuilding of the camp. And I met with Palestinian embassy and also Palestinians with the Lajna Sha'biya. And what was come up with, the international community said, we must create a validation map. Don't worry, I'll zoom in on this map in a moment. But this is Nahr al-Bared. That blue is the water, is the Mediterranean. But this is Nahr al-Bared, and they've divided it into sectors, okay? The international community said, well, in order for us to know where people had lived before the conflict, before the camp had been destroyed, we want every Palestinian family to come in with their titles. Those formal titles that the Lebanese said we will not recognize, well, de facto they were recognized because the international community had them come in and signed their family names, and neighbors on each side had to validate those claims. So you see here, even though formally those kind of claims to assets weren't being recognized, informally Palestinians were remarkably resilient in reproducing how they had maintained ownership in the camps and enforcement. And again, in interviews, when I asked Palestinians, well, how did you maintain enforcement? Did you go to the Lebanese? The mukhabarat are much more present in the camps in Nahr al-Bared now than ever before. The camp is much more highly regulated. The only reason I could enter it is because I have a refugee card. Not anyone that wants to can go into it. I know I was asked this earlier by some people at lunch. And so I said, you must have to go to the Lebanese if there's a disagreement. And once again, the Palestinians said, no way. We handle conflict amongst ourselves. Of course, if it's something very out of the norm, like which is very unusual to have a murder, but one could occur and has occurred in the camp, if that is the situation and the families can't agree on a reconciliatory term, that's the only time they'll go to authorities above them. But in general, conflict is resolved within the community, never involving outsiders. And so I want to conclude with a few lessons that I hope you can take away from this talk. And I know I threw a lot of information at you. But more broadly, stepping away from just looking at Palestinians, I think a lot of these lessons can be applied to other refugee communities or displaced communities. To remember that communities are much more resilient in the face of adversity than are commonly portrayed. Yes, people need basic aid like water and food, but beyond that, people have resourcefulness within this, and we should not rob them of that resourcefulness. Property rights offer one pathway to protection amid chaos, and moreover, they don't just serve an economic benefit, but they serve a community and social benefit in preserving that community's identity. And finally, I want to note, you're probably, some of you, if you are listening to this, you want to say, yeah, well, they had property rights, but there's been a bunch of times in which they've been challenged and the camp's been destroyed. What's the point in this whole thing if anyone can come in and drop a bomb and destroy it? Well, yes, that's the political reality. And I don't think we should say, oh, well, this is not a perfect system, so it's not a valuable one. I think we should take away that in the midst of really difficult, challenging conditions, people are doing the best they can. They're forming institutions that, yes, are imperfect and are definitely vulnerable to outside forces, but yet they still serve a very important function for the people living in that situation. And I can't end without discussing the Syrian issue, which is, I often am astounded that people talk about Syrian refugees as if we've never had a massive refugee crisis occur in the Middle East. I'm going to say it. This is not our first rodeo, and this is not the Lebanese's first rodeo or the Jordanians' first rodeo in welcoming, sometimes begrudgingly, large populations of refugees. They've done it before with Palestinians. So why not look to the Palestinian case as a potential, I don't know, model is the right word, but template to learn from. And to remember that I think looking to how Nahr al-Bared was reconstructed in 2007 after that conflict, why not use some of the lessons we learned there and how important it is to maintain the social fabric of a community when they're entering that space. And it also serves an idea of how a community might rebuild after conflict. The ways in which, if people are allowed to develop their own informal system of rules, those rules can translate to more formal settings as well. So thank you again for allowing me to speak for this period of time, and there's time for questions. Yeah.
What I want to know is go back to 1948.
Yes.
When you talked about the property ownership
Mm-hmm.
in the camps, Nahr al-Bared
Mm-hmm.
or the southern one, they started these camps as tents or no? They started these camps.
So what the people they want to record it.
Okay. So they started these camps as tents, and then they built them, or like now in Jordan, they had the camp just
Pre-built.
between the exactly Syrian and Jordanian borders. It's tents,
Mm-hmm.
you know. So were there tents before they built the house? And the other question will be, if someone did something shameful,
Yes.
was this also after 1948 or recently?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you for your question. So to answer your first question, in 1948, when Palestinians arrived, in general, the spaces they arrived to were empty. There is one instance in which Palestinians were in Lebanon specifically were moved into a former Armenian camp from the 1930s. That is one unusual case, but the large majority of instances were that Palestinians arrived. And remember that the Palestinian refugee situation predates the UN, the UNHCR, and that the UNRWA was specifically created after the refugee crisis began. And so there wasn't, and the Red Cross was involved, but there wasn't this formal worldwide system that exists today, like even a model to follow of how to handle mass refugee populations. And remember, this is on the heels of World War II, where there were mass migrations occurring across the world. And so most Palestinians arrived to largely empty places, except for that one Armenian example that I wanted to give you. And from that, tents were assigned to families or given to families. There were different types of tents in the camps, like smaller and larger ones. There were even hospital tents and school tents. And humorously, my father once said, unlike American children that often pray for snow days, my father used to pray for windy days when the tent would be blown over and school would have to be canceled. And so, but this is kind of what life was like early on. And from those early tents, over time they were built much more solid structures. And this is where, and I think many Arab men might be familiar, and women would be familiar with this common tale of remittances being used to fund construction in the camps. So many Palestinian men went and traveled to the Gulf, usually, and to parts of North Africa as well, to make money. And when they made money, they sent it back to their families. And my father also likes to say, no one would dare not share their income with their family, the shame, if the son went away and didn't send the money back. But that money was sent back to further improve their conditions within the camp. So they were given, they would slowly build one floor and then build above.
But the UN did not build those?
No, the UN did not build those. The UN provided extra resources, always provided social services like healthcare and education and food and water. But in interview after interview with UNRWA field office specialists, as well as like the head of the UNRWA in Beirut that I spoke with, the camps, they said repeatedly, we gave the Palestinians this large plot of land, the entire community, but we were not involved in kind of the divvying up of that land among Palestinians. That was their own, business. To answer your second question about the role of shame.
First question still. So when, let's say your brother went to the Gulf, made money, and he came and you built
Yes.
3 stories, then the ownership will be third store is for your uncle.
It's still within
Second
the
floor
family.
Is for yourselves, and the first floor is for your grandparents.
Yes.
Is this the way that the ownership works?
That's correct. I mean, it would still be maintained within the family name, but for example, the bottom floor would usually be the oldest members, and then the eldest son above them, and then another son. And as they had families, they lived within this multi-generational structure. Which is different, yes, than what is set up today for Syrians arriving largely in Jordan to like Zatari camp with pre-built, usually shipping containers, or as they're called, carton, that they all live in. But I think even though those structures are pre-built for them, the community can learn from the Palestinian examples. Don't just throw a person in a carton from wherever and let them live next to whoever. Let's try and preserve the social fabric and have neighbors, if possible, live next to previous neighbors. That social network provides security and allows them to maintain some sense of community even when they're in a displaced camp. And so the second question of yours was regarding shame. I think that is still powerfully used in the camps today, certainly. And I think, I don't mean to overplay that shame is always a good thing, right? Because there's some downsides to it. I think if you are marginal or different from the norm in the camp. You can be marginalized if you don't fall into what the community thinks is appropriate behavior. So say you get a divorce and you're a divorced woman, it's very difficult to find your place in society after you've been divorced in the camps. That is the truth. But I do think, aside from the negative downsides of shame, there is this positive aspect to it as a powerful enforcement tool in the absence of formal security or state protection.
George Hashmi.
Yeah,
I
thank you.
thank you for an excellent remarks today. I want to bring up two issues. One is, how do we regain the titles of our property in Palestine? Is the PLO doing anything about this? I mean, we are here, many of us are third generation
Yes.
Palestinians. My children are not going to remember what my great-grandfather gave us. We have no documents. Is the PLO doing anything like that? And the second thing, while you are a very good speaker and activist, I wish you would get contact with your colleagues in the Palestinian American university groups to work on these issues and help us all how to find out.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. So to respond to your first question, unfortunately, I think for Palestinians living in camps outside of the West Bank and Gaza, those that are in Jordan and Lebanon and Syria, and those within the Palestinian diaspora living in the United States and across the world today, I think if you are fortunate enough to have a paper title, and I was privileged for the first time this year to actually see official titles from Palestine from a man who's 98 years old, that's a Palestinian refugee still living today. And I saw those documents, and even in conversation with him, his name is Dr. Sayoun. He was the first Palestinian doctor, and he earned his medical degree in Britain and came in 1948 as an adult. He's almost 98 now, and was one of the first doctors and had a clinic even in Jerusalem specifically for UNRWA. And in talking to him, he said, even though I came from a wealthy, privileged Palestinian family that owned a lot of property, even he sees no potential, no hope that claim, even with massive legal documentation, to ever have that claim recognized. And in conversation with him, I don't feel like confident enough to speak on behalf of the PLO, so I won't do that. But in this one interaction, I will say that there was not much feeling of hope that the PLO was working to honor his claims today. And I think maybe if you consider the post-Oslo Accords, the way in which those accords were resolved, left the Palestinian refugee communities outside of the West Bank and Gaza somewhat high and dry. They were somewhat left out of that process. And I think this presents problems for any potential peace in the future, and any potential resettlement of those refugees living across the Middle East. And I think it is a good idea, by the way, to have an association of professors. I am part of an association of professors that studies the Middle East, not specifically that we're all Palestinian, but a strong cohort of us, especially in the Northeast and the Boston area, that are studying these issues, and we try to get together and promote each other's work. Inshallah. Yeah.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I really liked it a lot. My question is actually somewhat similar, because I've written about in the past a little bit about property law pre-Nakba, and there was this combination of under the Ottoman rule, how there was like an incentive.
Can you tell me your name?
Oh, William Yeomans.
Okay.
There was an incentive. There was an incentive
Yes.
for people to collectivize their land
Yes.
to avoid taxes.
The musha.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then there were like these
There's
absentee.
the musha and midi. Sorry, I don't know Turkish, so pardon my
No problem.
inappropriate pronunciation. But musha, M-I-R-I, midi, and another.
Something like that. I
Yes.
forgot too. So, but yeah, my point is, to what extent is that historical experience or that historical memory about losing the land and displacement and the complications around formality of title. I mean, I know it's all kind of nullified and erased by the Zionist project anyways, and there's the documents that are unenforced that you've referred to, but to what extent is that formative for how this plays out early on, and then is 1969, is the PLO, by pushing formalization, trying to address this historical, probably, the problems of informal property status that existed in Mandate Palestine and so on. So it's just kind of about, you didn't really talk about the historical experience so much. So I was wondering if you could fill in that blank.
Yeah, so I devote a lot of attention to this in the book in describing the types of ownership that Palestinians were familiar with prior to 1948, because I think there's a common Western misperception that there weren't any property claims, and I think that's based on an improper understanding of Ottoman law and how most subjects of the Ottoman Empire, pretty much no one owned actual property in the Western sense of an individual title. And there was incentive for collectivization of ownership, and there was this notion that if you worked the land, you owned it because of your working of it. And that is Turkish Ottoman law, but it made it very difficult when Westerners came in, because they were like, well, I don't see a law that looks like how it's back at my home, so I'm not going to recognize your claim. And if you actually think of it, there have been comparative studies of how Native American communities in the U.S. had very similar understandings of ownership, collectivized ownership of land, that were not recognized by, Westerner or Europeans that arrived in the Americas. A similar kind of phenomena occurred. And so I completely think that this idea of how important it is to have something written down, like we learned our lesson in 1948 because we didn't all have our titles, definitely played a role when people arrived in the camp in 1948. And I'll give you just one anecdote, a more recent one, of how I think this narrative of we have to show proof that we own something and hold the paper is from 2007. Because when that validation map was written, you would think that was a hard job, right? Think 20,000 people or more had to be brought in, every family member brought in. Head of each family had to be brought in to sign this document. And I asked, when I talked to the people that were administering the validation map, that were constructing it, was it hard? Were people like lying to you and saying, oh, I own this giant palatial home, like please build me a giant palatial home in the new camp? Did people lie? And they're like, no. I said, well, why not? And they said, first of all, it was pretty much impossible because all of them had their papers. I said, all of them? They had basically less than 24-hour notice to leave the camp. I don't know that my first thought would be, go find my property title. I'd probably be packing my kids' diapers and, running. But when I asked Palestinians, they said, of course, one of the top things, in addition to my gold, putting it in my purse and running away, I put my title in there. It was just, one person said in an interview, it was just as valuable as gold to me, which, if you know how we feel about gold, that's saying something. And so I think this notion of how powerful and important it is to have valid, kind of tangible proof of ownership. The Palestinians feel they've learned their historical lesson. We always have to have our papers. And so I think that's definitely something that continues to play out today. Incidentally, I think in 2014, a really good article on Turkish law and Palestinian understanding came out. I think his last name is Kemal, but I can give you the citation later if you want to add to your studies.
Hi, Phil Schrafer. I live up the street. Your presentation, kudos to your presentation. The PowerPoint, not too many bullets, lovely mix of photos, lovely, and your high energy presentation and your sharing of your own personal story. I know you went to, you're teaching now where Hillary Clinton graduated. Just wondered if you have any perspective on Hillary from your own experience.
So she'll be coming and giving her graduation speech, Wellesley's graduation speech, in just a couple weeks. So I'll be sitting front row, and I'll have to give you notes on how that talk went. I think in the context of American politics, it's always pretty challenging to find someone that is a champion of the Palestinian cause. And I think for reasons that we don't have to go into now, like the political realities of American politics preclude someone from getting overly involved in it. And even Bernie Sanders, who many people felt was most likely to champion Palestinians, I think recently came out against the BDS movement, and very forcefully too, even when asked point blank. And so I think like these are kind of the indicators that I actually respect Hillary in some regard. I mean, I don't just say in some. I do respect her fully. I respect her as being a woman in politics in this country today is very challenging, and she is very smart. And I know after teaching Wellesley women that they are way smarter even than me, and they teach me every time I have them in class. And so I definitely respect her, but I think to find anyone to be a true, as what maybe some of us in this room might want to see as someone championing the Palestinian position, I don't think that's true. I want to also point out that Wellesley is really invested in working on this refugee issue, and Madeleine Albright is also an alumna of Wellesley, and in February I had the opportunity of being on a panel with Madeleine Albright and other people that are experts on the refugee situation, talking not just about Palestinians but also the Syrian crisis. And there's a lot of people that care deeply about the issue of truly treating refugees with dignity. And so I think, in that regard, Wellesley is definitely behind that. And many students this summer, in fact, are going and working in refugee camps, Palestinian camps and Syrian ones this summer. So there is a lot of activism.
If I may, thank you, Dr. Hajj, for coming in and giving this very enlightening talk. I'm excited to read your book. I have a question. So how is this specifically, maybe the Arab states were able to absorb the refugees? Could this happen outside of, the Arab world, or is it uniquely Arab?
Yeah, I think this is a really hard question to handle, especially if when you said this, what came to mind is even the lack of openness in our own country to accepting refugees, and the recent, refugee ban, as some will have called it, and even Europe closing much of its doors to recent refugees. I think there's a fear of refugees, just as there's a fear of migrants in the U.S. And throughout history, there's always been a fear of the most recent incoming group, whoever that was in history. I think there's broader issues of destabilization, economic destabilization in states. And I think the Middle East is not immune to these problems. I think if you look at Lebanon and Jordan, especially Jordan and the amount of refugees they've accepted, it's astounding given their economic failures, and the fact that there's already high unemployment rates within those countries, and adding more and more, in effect, cheap labor to compete with local populations is disturbing to people. And I think the challenge for Arab states as well as Western states is, I think, solving their own economic issues so that they can treat with greater dignity the refugees that are entering. And one thing that should be noted is that according to international refugee law, refugees have the right to work. You cannot deny a refugee the right to work. And it is one of the basic rights of refugees to work. And so in denying them the ability to produce and work for themselves and better themselves, we are violating international rights and international law. And I think that is something, if we believe in human rights and we subscribe to that the morality of those, we can't forget that as we approach people. I wish Lucy and I had a solution, right? I think this is a place for further research. What is both the economic ability of states to absorb refugee populations, and what's the best strategy going forward to help integrate them or to resettle them somewhere else? I think actually the U.S. was doing some good things prior to our ban in trying to integrate Syrians and any refugee that entered our country. I gave a talk at Pittsburgh not so long ago, and I was really tired because I had to get in a cab at 2:30 in the morning to make my 5:30 flight. So I'm begrudgingly walking down the stairs, and I get into this cab, and we go off and we start talking, And as soon as the man starts talking, I say, "Hey, this man sounds Arab." And he says, "Oh, and I say, "Do you speak Arabic?" In Arabic to him. He said, "Yeah, I do. You know, I noticed your name was Nadia Haj." And I thought, "Oh, that's an Arab too." So we started talking, and I discovered that he's a Syrian refugee that had come to the United States just 1 year before. And I asked him, "Well, what was it like? How did you come to where you live now, being a taxi driver at 3 a.m. in Pittsburgh," right? And so he said, "The U.S. has lots of problems, and I'm really afraid of what's happening right now because Donald Trump had recently been elected, and it was during this time of the immigration ban and refugee ban kind of being subject to legal challenges." And he said, "It makes me really sad because I wanted to tell you, even though it doesn't seem like anything great to be having a job, driving a cab, I have 2 children under the age of 3. Both of them were born in Indonesian labor camps, in Indonesian kind of almost prison camps, because in their attempt to flee Syria, they ended up in Indonesia through a variety of means, and Indonesia did not help them become reintegrated into society, and they basically lived in not a labor camp, but like a detention center is a better way of putting it, for years. And he said, both my children were born there and I could do nothing. And so all I did was I had one English book, like how to learn English. And I wasn't that great in Syria in learning English in high school, but you better believe I spent every moment I could learning English. And the moment I came to the US and I was accepted into the refugee program and my family was brought here, unlike in Indonesia, I was welcomed. Like there was a plan for me. I had classes available to me. There was even an employment kind of counselor to help me find a job. They helped us and gave us rent for a few months, and it's not easy. He's like, I'm struggling to survive, but at least I can try and do it for myself. And I think that, like, you know, we can be down on the U.S. right now. Sometimes it's easy to, but I don't think we should. I don't think we should forget our successes, and that we were running a pretty good refugee resettlement program. It wasn't perfect, but it was doing a lot for the people that were accepted into it. And I think that that's something, you know, on this 3 a.m. cab ride, as I'm driving to the Pittsburgh airport, I was really astounded to learn the possibility of what we can do to help people. And it doesn't take that much money to do it. And that's something I think all states can learn from.
Thank you, Ellen Siegel. Did you leave the taxi driver a nice tip?
Yes, I actually gave him all the money in my wallet, which I don't have. I'm a professor, let's be real, right? But that was $60, and plus the cabs. So I gave him a $60 tip, which was as much as I could offer.
I just have a suggestion that your first slide is from 1953.
Mm-hmm.
It would be nice, and then you go to something more sophisticated. A picture of what Palestine looked like before you left.
That's a
like
very good idea.
1947, to see, go from there to a tent.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great idea.
I found that some of these camps are divided by PLO factions.
Yes.
Not just families or where they came from, if you could comment on that.
Mm-hmm.
And Nara Barrett is in such a beautiful location. I mean, it's by the sea in those 2 sections.
And strategically important as well.
It's beautiful. It could be a resort. I'm sure Lebanon would like to see it as a resort, not a refugee camp. The playground in Nara Barrett is supposedly, it's privately owned, and it's being rented. But, I mean, maybe, yeah. And as you know, it's not in fabulous condition. There's still containers and so forth.
Yeah. Yes, and so to speak to your question, so first I think it's really important, your idea of incorporating photography or images from what life was like in Palestine. I think that's a fantastic idea, and there are wonderful books out there that I could borrow from and cite to that effect. The second is, you're right, especially in the 1980s and during Lebanon civil war, you saw within the camps a lot of political factions based on parties and not families. And I think that is a layer definitely there. I don't think they subvert the system of property rights that exist, and I recognize them, but I didn't. Theoretically, I didn't engage them very much. I think that is like there have been texts written about the war of the camps in Lebanon, as you know very intimately, and kind of some of what occurred during that time. I think those factions still remain today, and with the waxing and waning of the PLO's authority and Hamas's authority within the occupied territories, you see some of those dynamics also playing out within the camps. And your third point, how does the camp look today? And so my parents were just there yesterday in Nahid, and I asked them to take pictures for me so that I have the most recent kind of photos. In conversations with them, my mom said the camp is much more modern looking and definitely better looking than the photo I showed you in 2005, but that there's some issues and some things we talked about when we were speaking with each other. One being that some strategic decisions were made about how the camp would be designed. So one, for example, was the width of the lanes. So the lanes are especially wide. And it's not because they wanted people to be able to walk on sidewalks and to have this vibrant community. No, that wasn't the architectural reason. It was so that tanks can fit down them. So that was one of the things that was mentioned. Another thing is, I know this by talking to the engineers that designed it, the pipes running underneath the camps are too small. And I said, well, why? And they said, well, because the Lebanese, for security reasons, did not want the pipes to be wide enough for a human to go through. But problematically, if there's ever a problem, like there's an issue or a breakdown of a pipe, no one can go in there to fix it because no human can get in there. So there's the security issue of not letting people tunnel, but there's also the practical issue of maintaining that infrastructure. So, I think that there's some design issues that in the landscape of the camp today, there's definitely issues. It's not a utopia, what the camp is today, that's for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, it's my question. I'm trying Ellen. First, I want to tell Ellen, 2 years ago, we have a friend that we knew, and he knew he was going to die. So he allocated so much of his funds, and his wife went specially to Nahr al-Barid, and he wanted to build the most modern, fantastic playground for the kids over there. Yeah, and they did, and apparently people were very, very happy. So at least Nahr al-Barid, there is something for the little kids to do now.
Yes. And can I actually say something? Because in mentioning death, you've actually, I want to make an appeal to you because, and this is something I wanted to mention to Samita, which isn't part of this presentation, but I'm starting work on my next book. And I was very inspired by reading Edward Said's memoir about his own life in Lebanon, and how he still felt dispossessed even though he was living in Lebanon. He still felt like a stranger, though it was the Middle East, because he was Palestinian. And in his memoir, he describes how when his father died, who had lived in a Lebanese village most of his adult life and served that community, that they had assumed that his father would be permitted burial in the Lebanese village. But in fact, the Lebanese village denied it. And so his family was desperately and had to do a lot of work to find a place to bury his father. And so my next project is trying to look at how refugees generally, but Palestinians specifically, bury with dignity their loved ones. And this is also spurred because my own uncle, my dad's eldest brother, passed away in August. And it was a question, where would we bury him if he could not go home to Palestine, and there's limited space left within the cemeteries in these camps? And Lebanese don't want to allow the burial of Palestinians in their own cemeteries. How do families navigate it? Edward Said described it as statelessness even in death. Like your dead body has nowhere even to go. And I was struck by this poem, Mahmoud Darwish's poem, The Earth is Closing In on Us. And I think some of you might know that one line from this, After the Last Sky, Edward Said used as one of the titles in his book. But there's a poem, but there's another line in this that I hope will be the title of my book, which will be After the Last Frontier. But in this poem, Mahmoud Darwish says, "Where should we go after the last frontiers? Where should the birds fly after the last sky? Where should the plants sleep in the last breath of air, after the last breath of air? We will write our names with scarlet steam. We will cut off the hand of the song to be finished by our flesh. We will die here, here in the last passage, here, and here our blood will plant its olive tree." But this notion of even in death, you're still a refugee. And I want to learn by speaking, and if you have a story you'd like to share with me, please contact me, of trying to bury a loved one that was a refugee in a camp. Please contact me, because my next project is trying to answer this question of how families navigate this issue. And that's what it was inspired by. So I just wanted to make my plea out there, and I'm open to hearing from you and getting your help.
Cremation has become very popular.
Okay.
You have to say something.
Yes.
It's a very interesting thing.
That I would like to hear about. Yes.
Okay, the second question, you said ownership properties. Okay, we should not forget that in 1948, people outside of Jerusalem and all these areas, they were not used to wars or,
Yes. Yes. They weren't prepared.
Exactly. And with all the bombs that happened, they fled. And when they fled, it was so quickly, they left their papers.
Yes.
But they tell you, oh, we have the key of the
Yes,
house.
and that is why
And
the
that
cover
is
of my
very
book has a
important.
key.
Exactly. And the key of the house, because they knew that this was not going to last too long, 2-3 months, and we will be back. And they never came back. In the meantime, you have these people who live now in the Selwan area, which is
Yes.
10 minutes away from the old city, and they have their papers, everything is with them,
Yes.
and yet they are either demolishing their own homes,
Yes.
or the Israeli army is going to demolish their home. And they went to the municipality, to the Jerusalem municipality or whatever it is, and they showed their ownership paper. Did
Yes.
it help?
No.
No.
Yes, I
It
think
did
that's
not.
important to recognize
Yes.
as well.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that if you'd like to talk to Nadia informally, we're going to be selling her book over there, and she can sign it for you.
Yes.
Thank you, Nadia.
Thank
This
you
was
again.
great.
This
Thank
is
you
such
so
an
much.
honor. Thank you.